This is one of my favorite artifacts in the museum. Because of the pressures of African Americans basically demanding freedom, fleeing from the institution of slavery, Lincoln had to do something. And what Lincoln does is he issues, after the Battle of Antietam in 1862, the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation is crucially important for what it does, but also for what it doesn't do. It is the first time the federal government really embraces freedom, says that freedom of the enslaved is crucial to the success of a nation. But it also said that it freed people who were under the control of the Confederacy. So in other words, it really was symbolic more than actual, because the Confederacy would ignore it. And if you were enslaved in areas that were already owned by the Union because the Union had captured them, this act didn't free you at all. But what it does do is it begins to send this notion that freedom is crucial, and that in essence, Juneteenth is really a recognition of the fact that word of the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't reach Galveston, Texas until 1865. But what it means is that when it reaches Texas, there is this powerful eruption of joy and a belief that this was going to really change the country. And that in essence, Juneteenth is really part of that celebration of freedom, of a country, of a place of work in progress. And this small document is really what I call the Pocket Emancipation Proclamation. It's a way that people were able to suddenly go into the South and Union soldiers and take this out when you came across the plantation to help people understand that you are now free. So freedom, the power of freedom, the importance of freedom, the promise of freedom is really crucially important to understanding 19th century America. So the promise of freedom, the hope that many of the enslaved had when word of the Emancipation Proclamation arrived on Juneteenth in Galveston, Texas. The promise of freedom is that for many people, they believed that immediately after the Civil War, America would change in profound ways. There was this great promise of freedom, and in some ways, a period immediately after the Civil War was a time when you suddenly see blacks having the right to vote. You see amendments to the Constitution, the 13th Amendment ending slavery, the 14th Amendment making African Americans citizens, the 15th Amendment giving African Americans the vote. And as a result of that, you see African Americans elected to state legislatures and even to the U.S. Congress. For a period, there was a sense that the promise, that the struggle of the Civil War would lead to a new America. But candidly, within 15 or 20 years, use of violence and terrorism began to erode the freedom of the African Americans, and that slowly people lost land, they lost the right to vote, and they faced an era of segregation. But the most important thing is that the promise of freedom that came with those amendments, that came with the belief that America would always be a place of freedom, that idea was never lost. And African Americans dipped into that reservoir of possibility throughout the rest of the 19th, 20th, and now into the 21st century. So the struggle for freedom was the most important struggle in the 19th century because it dramatically altered the fate of America even to this day. And so I think one of the things that is really important is to remember that throughout the 19th and into the 20th century, the most important day for African Americans was really January 1st. It was the day when they celebrated the coming of freedom. We talk for hours now about Watch Night, and we always talk about Watch Night as the moment when African Americans are celebrating the new year. The reality is they're not celebrating the new year. They're celebrating the moment that freedom came on January 1st. And that notion of Emancipation Day was the most important holiday for African Americans. There were parades really for the next 50 years that would celebrate that moment. It's important for this museum to help people remember, because we help them remember that there has been this amazing community that has demanded America live up to its stated ideal. And that in essence, one of the things this museum believes strongly in is that we have a responsibility as Americans to continue to challenge, to continue to prod, to continue to let America be America, to let America live up to its stated ideals. And that is why this museum is here. So I want to thank you all for listening to me. You know, you give a historian a captive audience, he could go on for days. But I hope that you have found some of the learning that we have here, found some of the unbelievable pride in the resiliency of a people.